Hello, my friend. It's the 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. My name is Joel, and this week I'm thinking about a marathon I ran. It was in 2020, early 2020 in January, so, before all that other stuff happened in that year. And I had trained for this marathon and was excited about it, but I had never run over 20 miles in my preparation. So for those of you unfamiliar, a marathon is 26.2 miles. Got to get that extra 0.2 mile in there. But I hadn't gone for a run that long, but I knew I was in the condition to complete the run. What I didn't realize, what I didn't think about, was that though my body was in condition to complete that 26.2 miles, mentally I hadn't really trained for that. And let me tell you, around mile 22, the wheels came off. Everything hurt. My feet were covered in blisters. My knees were sore. I was running in Phoenix in January, which is still very nice, but it can still get a little bit warmer. And those last 4.2 miles were an absolute grind. I think my mile time went from like an 8-minute mile at the beginning of the race, which I'm like, oh, it's a good pace, I can hold that pace, to like a 14-minute mile at the end. It was absolutely brutal, but I finished the race, and it was really a mental game, and I hadn't considered that when I began my training. We've all had moments like that where we get into something, and suddenly when we're in it, we're like, oh, I had not prepared for this. I had not thought about this. I had not walked through this, and now I'm here and I don't know exactly what to do. I bet we've come across moments like that in our walk with Jesus as well. Moments where we're confronted with a situation or a moment, we're like, ooh, I didn't think about this. This is exactly what Jesus is addressing this week in the gospel, where again, we get a real sharp statement from Jesus that at first listen, at first read, can put us back on our heels. The gospel starts out with Jesus saying, unless somebody comes to me hating their father and mother and brother and sister, they cannot be my disciple. I'm like, man, that seems pretty harsh, Jesus, because I love my family and I want to be with my family and I want to take care of my family. And why would I hate my mother and my father and my siblings and my kids? That seems really antithetical. Jesus is using hyperbole here, which is a statement made with exaggeration, not meant to be taken literally. He wants to really create in the listener's mind the understanding that unless you are detached from everything, you're not going to be ready for the demands of discipleship. We know this is hyperbole because of what comes next. Jesus further dives into this statement and what it means by talking about ways that we do or don't count the cost of something. He talks about a builder building something and that, before they build something, they sit down and they say, how much is this going to cost? Because I don't want to start building it and then run out of money. Talks about a king and an army and the fact that before this king goes into battle, he says, do I have a reasonable expectation that I can win this? Because if I don't, I need to send somebody to go make peace. Otherwise, we're going to be decimated. Jesus says these are the ways we need to count the cost of discipleship. Am I ready to follow Jesus? What am I willing to give up or not give up if I'm asked to? Jesus says, unless you have a disposition where you're ready to be in conflict with your family, and we heard about that a couple of weeks ago in the gospel, that sometimes Jesus is divisive, then you're not ready to be a disciple. If you're not ready to leave behind material possessions and to leave behind maybe jobs, or to leave behind choices for school, or to leave behind groups of friends, or habits, or behaviors, you're not ready to be my disciple. Because on the road to discipleship, Jesus is going to ask us to do hard things. Jesus is going to ask us to do scary things. And it doesn't mean that they're less scary, but to be detached from those things, to make those big jumps, we can't do it unless we've prepared ourselves to do it. I didn't realize that around mile 22, the mental game was going to kick in. Now, if I run a marathon again, I know. But being prepared for that moment changes how I embrace the moment. At the time I encountered it, I was like, this is terrible. How am I going to make it? I don't know if I can do it. Now, if I train for a race, I'm going to think through, how am I going to think? How am I going to act? What am I going to say to myself at mile 22? How am I going to be ready for how awful that moment is going to be so that it doesn't destroy me or make me want to quit the race? What are you going to do when that moment comes? I think a great way to think about this is to imagine if you're going to Mars, right? There's these people who are training allegedly for a mission to Mars where they'll go. But what strikes me about this mission is that when they go, they don't get to come back. Like, we can get people to Mars, but we can't get them back from Mars. So if you sign up to go, you live there forever. You're going to die on Mars. What would be hardest for you to give up in that situation, to leave behind? If you were going to get on that rocket and go to Mars, be one of the first pioneers there, what would be difficult to let go of? Whatever you thought of, that's the thing you've got to pray into detachment for. What if Jesus pointed to that thing, said, hey, I need you to leave this behind to be my disciple? Would you really have to think about it? Or would you even look at Jesus and say, I don't think I can? It doesn't mean that we give up that thing. It just means that we have to recognize that we have an attachment to it that's bigger than our relationship with Jesus, and that needs to change. This is a life work, but it's a work we have to be mindful of. And that's the challenge we get in the gospel is, are you willing to count the cost of discipleship? How far are you willing to go? And when you hit that moment where it's an absolute grind, where it's difficult, and where Jesus looks at you and says, in order to keep following me, you're going to have to let some things go. Are you ready to do that? Are you prepared to do that? And the way we do that is by thinking through it now, by praying into it now, most importantly, asking the grace to become detached from those things now. It doesn't mean that God's going to ask us to give them up, but if he did, would you be ready? Would you be ready to take that step out into the unknown? That's the cost of discipleship. We have to remember the reward of discipleship is something far greater than anything we could lose. This has been the 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. I hope you have a great weekend. Listen to these readings at Mass and offer up on the altar this week that thing that you need to be detached from and ask the Lord to give you the grace to do that. And then come on back here next week for more insights from the readings right here on Summit.